Trump loses it over empty parade after confronted by Jasmine Crockett. Donald Trump threw himself a $40 million birthday parade, and the streets were embarrassingly empty. But it wasn't until Jasmine Crockett calmly confronted him in front of the nation that everything truly fell apart. The sky over Washington, D.C. hung heavy that afternoon, but the real weight came from something else. Expectation, weeks of planning, months of hype. Trump's 79th birthday parade was sold as a spectacle of strength, a tribute to his legacy, and a patriotic celebration that would make history. Giant flags lined the streets near Pennsylvania Avenue. Helicopters hovered. Tanks were positioned along a cleared path. Military personnel stood in tight rows, waiting for a crowd that never showed rows of metal bleachers. Once draped in bunting stood mostly empty. There were pockets of people, sure, some diehard supporters with red hats and flags. Some confused tourists, but the throngs Trump had promised nowhere to be seen. No wall-to-wall humanity. No deafening cheers, just scattered applause that echoed uncomfortably down the avenue. The camera crews knew it. They avoided wide shots. Drone footage was mysteriously pulled. Mid-broadcast news anchors struggled to describe the turnout without openly mocking it. Even Fox News pivoted early to highlight the symbolism of the moment rather than the turnout itself. But the contrast was sharp behind the forced smiles and the blaring trumpets. There was a visible unease within Trump's own camp. His staff shuffled nervously behind him. Security whispered to aides. Aides whispered to each other. What was meant to feel like a coronation was already curdling into something else, a costly public reminder of lost momentum. The president himself stood at the center of it, waving with exaggerated confidence. His voice, when it boomed over the speakers, still carried that same brash tone, but his eyes kept drifting. He scanned the distance, maybe expecting more people to come flooding in late. They didn't. What complicated everything was how the date wasn't just about his birthday. June 14th also marked the 250th anniversary of the U.S. Army. What was supposed to be a day honoring military service had instead been transformed into a pageant focused on a single man. Veterans groups had voiced concerns quietly weeks before. Now those murmurs were getting louder. A retired colonel standing in the audience shook his head. This was supposed to be about the troops. He muttered to a reporter. Not a birthday bash. The money, too, couldn't be ignored. Over $40 million spent on tanks, robot dogs, pyrotechnics, and coordination. It wasn't hard to imagine what else. That could have gone toward upgrading VA hospitals, PTSD programs, housing for homeless vets. Instead, it went into a parade that no one really wanted to attend, and Americans weren't blind to it. Photos flooded social media before the official live stream. Even ended empty seats. Empty streets, images that said more than words ever could within hours. Hashtags like #emptychairs. For Trump and #parade of one were trending on every platform. Trump's allies tried to spin it. They blamed traffic, construction miscommunication about parade routes, even the weather. But the truth was glaring. People had simply chosen not to come. The absence was louder than any protest, and speaking of protest, just a few miles away, something else was happening. But while Trump tried to command a silent crowd, millions of others had already found their voices, somewhere else, just a few miles away from the hollow spectacle of the parade. The energy on the ground was completely different. While Trump waved at empty bleachers in D.C., the streets of Baltimore, Oakland, St. Louis, and dozens of other cities were overflowing signs bobbed above. Heads, drums thudded in rhythm. Strangers walked shoulder to shoulder, black, white, Latino, Asian young, and old pushing strollers or wheelchairs, chanting the same words over and over. No kings? It had started online weeks before as a quiet murmur of frustration. But by the time June 14th rolled around, No King's Day had become something much bigger. What began as a handful of organizers on Reddit and Instagram exploded into a national protest, spanning all 50 states. People didn't just show up, they showed up early in huge numbers, and with purpose in Minneapolis, they filled Washington Avenue In Phoenix, they packed Roosevelt Row in Topeka. Kansas, they marched in 90-degree heat. No celebrities, no TV crews following anyone around, just homemade signs, sidewalk chalk, water jugs, and a message that didn't require a microphone. There were chants about democracy, about veterans, about dignity. One man stood in Sacramento holding a giant cardboard cutout of an empty throne. Another in Columbus wore a simple t-shirt that read, "A real leader doesn't throw himself a parade." Nobody had to explain what it meant, and it wasn't angry, at least not in the way some had feared. It was pointed-focused, full of people who were tired of seeing their country turned into a vanity project. What shook observers most was how organized it all was and how peaceful. No looting, no violence, just miles of marching organized community aid, and thousands of volunteers and Dallas college students handed out sandwiches to protesters. In Missoula, a nurse set up a shaded area with free sunscreen and first aid in Cincinnati. 2 high schoolers rigged a speaker system to let a 74-year-old retired judge give a speech about government that listens. The system cut in and out, but no one left. They listened. A woman in Salt Lake City carried a sign that simply read, "This isn't about red or blue, it's about right and wrong." And that was the point. This wasn't about political parties. It wasn't about left or right. It was about the growing feeling that something fundamental was being warped, twisted, to serve one man's ego as photos of Trump's parade filtered online, showing vacant rows and forced smiles. Those participating in No King's Day didn't celebrate his embarrassment. Most just shook their heads because they understood what was at stake wasn't about one person failing. It was about what that kind of failure meant for the rest of the country. In a cafe in Milwaukee, a young woman named Audra scrolled through her phone while holding her protest sign. She showed her friend a live stream of the parade. "That's it," she whispered, genuinely surprised. Her friend leaned in. Guess people finally stopped showing up for him. But it wasn't just college kids and activists in Birmingham. An elderly Vietnam veteran named Larry Dawson marched with a cane when asked by a local reporter why he came. He didn't hesitate. "My back's wrecked. I can't walk for long, but I wasn't going to sit home while that man played dress up with my service." The statement hit hard by evening. The numbers started rolling in. Over 6 million people had participated across the country. 6 million compared to the 40,000 or so who had appeared at the DC parade. The math wasn't just lopsided, it was historic news. Networks finally had to acknowledge. Anchor after anchor shifted tone. What was supposed to be a celebration of Trump's legacy had turned into the biggest national protest since the Women's March in 2017. But this time, it wasn't just about a policy. It was about a pattern of self-obsession and showmanship that had gone too far. And all of it was happening in real time. Twitter feeds, TikToks, Facebook live streams. People were watching both events, side by side. The lonely parade and the streets roaring with life. No editing required. The contrast spoke for itself. The White House communications team tried to shift the narrative again, claiming the president was deeply moved by both the parade and the peaceful demonstrations. But it was too late. Public opinion had already turned. But while the country marched, one woman in Congress sat quietly biding her time, waiting for her chance to speak back inside the marbled walls of a private wing at the Hay Adams Hotel. A few blocks from the parade route, Trump's inner circle had gone into full damage control mode. The mood was raw. Staffers circled like crows around a conference table, littered with bottled water. Rumpled event programs and discarded printouts of crowd estimates. No one dared speak. First, the former president sat slouched in a high back chair near the window, arms crossed, face blank, watching the protest outside build momentum. He didn't say anything for almost 5 minutes when he finally spoke. His voice was low-clipped and sharp enough to slice the silence. "Someone needs to tell me what the hell happened out there." The room stayed still. Then came the scramble. One aide blamed city logistics. Another said road closures scared off attendees. Someone even floated the excuse that the protest organizers must have bribed TikTok influencers to sabotage turnout. It sounded desperate. It was desperate. What stung the most wasn't just the low numbers, it was the symbolism. This parade wasn't pitched as a casual celebration. It was meant to be monumental. Historic, another headline for the history books. Instead, it had been drowned out by teenagers with poster boards and cardboard crowns. Trump stood up, suddenly pacing. He clutched a manila folder filled with early crowd analytics and poll snapshots. The page on top had a brutal headline in bold black font: America chose to march against him. He slapped it down on the table. We're not letting this stick. He barked. Someone from the PR team suggested rolling out a new message frame, the parade, as a symbol of freedom. Say Trump welcomed peaceful protest as a sign of healthy democracy. But Trump waved that off. No, we don't share the moment, we take it back. The next idea was to shift the news cycle, push a story about economic gains under his leadership, reignite something about gas prices dropping. But again, it wasn't enough. The problem wasn't that people were distracted. It was that they were looking directly at him and not liking what they saw. Later that night, a text thread between staffers lit up. Someone inside leaked a quote from the meeting. He looked out the window, saw the protests, and said, "They think this is a movement." I've survived worse. It didn't take long for that line to spread, and not the way they hoped. Meanwhile, over at a late-night panel on MSNBC, the footage of the nearly empty parade kept looping beside live scenes from Seattle and Kansas City, where protesters were still going strong. Long after sunset, a retired strategist on the panel leaned into the mic and said, "You don't need to be a Pulitzer to understand what just happened. This wasn't a one-day mistake. This was a collapse of the illusion." The word stuck: collapse behind closed doors. Trump's longtime allies were starting to turn the page. Donors once eager to be linked to his brand were pulling back quietly. One PAC canceled a fundraising dinner scheduled for the following week. A senator from Ohio, usually a dependable voice of loyalty, released a statement suddenly distancing himself from the parade's messaging. By morning, Trump had gone from celebration to containment. Every show of strength had backfired. He called in old friends from his media. Days tried to book interviews where he could control the questions, but most of the hosts weren't picking up the phone. They'd seen the numbers, they were waiting, and Jasmine Crockett was waiting too. She'd watched the parade like everyone else. Not on a TV in a big office, but from her laptop at home. She had saved the live stream, downloaded the footage, and taken her own notes. She didn't smile. She didn't tweet. She just watched quiet, still waiting for the opportunity she knew would come. But no one in that war room expected the real trouble would come. Not from outside protesters, but from inside the Capitol. Jasmine Crockett had seen enough. She didn't need a political analyst or a news cycle to tell her what was going on. The empty bleachers, the oversized tanks, the millions marching in every direction. But toward Trump, it was all there. Plain as day, she wasn't interested in scoring a viral moment. She wasn't craving airtime. What she wanted was something deeper. Something that had been building inside her for years. A reckoning inside her modest office. On the third floor of the Rayburn building, she sat at her desk phone, face down, one hand on her temple. The window was cracked just enough to let the noise from outside drift in faint chants, still echoing across D.C. Even 2 days after the parade, she wasn't smiling, but there was a calmness in her eyes, like someone who had waited patiently for the right moment and finally saw it arriving. She clicked the remote. The same footage played again. Trump stepping down from the military vehicle, waving with forced enthusiasm. His expression was strained. His stride, hesitant, she paused the frame on a close-up his lips. Tight eyes scanning the empty rows like they'd betrayed him. She stared at it for a beat too long, then she shut the TV off. This wasn't about humiliation. Not for her, she knew that ego-driven spectacles collapse eventually. But what mattered more was what came next. The hearing on the government's spending was already scheduled. Trump had been invited months ago to speak about defense allocations. Back then, no one thought the parade would even be mentioned. Now, it was the elephant in the room, and Jasmine had the receipts. A thick folder sat in front of her. Inside were reports from watchdog groups, line by line, breakdowns of the parade's costs, veteran statements, and social media screenshots. She had even pulled quotes from Trump's own team that contradicted each other, proof that they were scrambling, but she didn't need flashy edits or headline-grabbing gotchas. All she needed was her voice and a short window of time. Her aide Mark poked his head in through the door. C-SPAN just confirmed they'll be broadcasting live. She nodded. Good. You're really going in on this, huh? Jasmine looked up from the folder. He used the military as a birthday balloon. That's not politics. That's personal. Mark nodded slowly, then stepped back out. What made Jasmine different wasn't just her preparation. It was the way she let silence do the work. She didn't try to fill the air with noise or jargon. She didn't come armed with one-liners or hashtags. She came with facts, numbers, consequences, and that's what kept her dangerous to someone like Trump. She remembered an old conversation she'd had with a retired nurse in Cincinnati. During a town hall, the woman had stood up, hands shaking, and said, "Every time they waste our money, it comes out of somebody's medicine." That stuck with her. It lived in her bones now. This wasn't abstract. It was real. And the $40 million spent on a vanity parade wasn't just an insult, it was a theft. In the days after the parade, her inbox filled up with messages. Some were from veterans who'd watched from their living rooms, furious and tired. Others were from young activists begging for her to speak up. There was even one from a military wife in Spokane who wrote, "We're invisible until he needs a photo op." Jasmine read every word, and she didn't answer them right away. She didn't post some rehearsed statement or call a press conference. She just waited. She gathered, she studied, because when the moment came, she didn't want to meet it with emotion. She wanted to crush it with clarity. Her office door was shut. Now outside the building, buzzed with last-minute prep for the hearing, reporters were already lining up in the hallways. Staffers hustled past with coffee cups and clipboards, but inside, Jasmine was still. She looked down at her notes again, then slowly she closed the folder. Her lips parted and just loud enough for herself to hear. She whispered, "All right, let's see how loud silence can be." But as she gathered her materials for the morning, she didn't yet know just how unprepared he really was. The hearing room had the kind of tension you could feel on your shoulders. Not because anyone was yelling. No one was not. Yet it was the quiet that made people sit straighter. Speak softer. Cameras lined the back wall, reporters scribbled in tight, slanted shorthand. Every seat in the gallery was full. Even the usually ignored corners. No one wanted to miss what was about to happen. At the center of the room sat Donald Trump. He looked stiff in his suit, legs, planted wide arms resting on the polished wood like he was back in a boardroom. He didn't speak, he just watched as members of the committee filed in. One by one, his eyes followed each of them, scanning for hostility or weakness. He didn't find either in Jasmine Crockett. She was one of the last to enter simple black dress, straight posture, no entourage, no press handler trailing behind her. Whispering points, just a folder tucked under one arm, and the kind of focus that made people step out of her path without realizing they had, across from her. Trump raised an eyebrow, a smile flickered at the edge of his mouth. He wasn't worried yet. The chair gavelled in the session. Today, we are here to examine recent allocations of federal funds directed toward public defense initiatives, including the June 14th military parade. Polite murmurs circled the room. Journalists leaned closer to their devices. Everyone knew what this really was on paper. It was about budgets and protocol. In reality, it was a reckoning waiting to be called into the room for the first half hour. It stayed formal. Members asked questions about logistics. Defense officials gave rehearsed answers. Numbers were exchanged, timelines were walked through. Trump sat still occasionally, adjusting his microphone. Never once interrupted, then Jasmine's name was called. Representative Crockett. You have 5 minutes. She didn't look at Trump when she stood up. She looked down at her folder, opened it neatly, then began reading. With a calm tone that didn't ask for attention, it demanded it in reviewing the allocation of $42.3 million for the June 14th parade in Washington, D.C. I found multiple inconsistencies regarding its stated purpose and its actual execution. She turned a page. The original brief cited national unity and military appreciation. But from where I sit, and from what millions of Americans saw, it looked less like unity and more like a birthday party, with tanks that got a few stifled laughs in the gallery. Trump's jaw twitched. She continued, I'm holding in my hand a list of VA centers still underfunded where veterans are waiting months, sometimes years, for care centers that could have used even a fraction of that money. But instead, it went to drone displays and inflatable mascots. Trump leaned toward the mic. Excuse me. She didn't stop. She didn't raise her voice. She just kept going. There were reportedly over 6 million people in the streets. Protesting that same day, they didn't need drones or robot dogs. They brought signs. Their feet did the marching. Their voices did the work. Trump pushed the button on his mic. That's a lie. That's a media number. I've seen real reports now. She looked up directly at him. You can dispute the numbers, Mr. Trump, but not the message. The room fell quiet again. She turned another page. You claimed the parade was for the troops. Yet multiple veteran groups released statements saying they weren't consulted, weren't invited, and weren't comfortable with the political tone. In fact, one group said, and I quote, "We serve this country to protect democracy, not elevate a man above it." Trump's hands clenched, but he said nothing. Jasmine closed the folder, slowly, deliberately. I'm not here to argue over optics. I'm here to ask who exactly benefited from this event, because from where I'm standing, the only person who celebrated that day was you. But Trump wasn't known for sitting quiet when his ego took a hit, and he wasn't about to start. Now the room shifted the moment she stopped speaking. It wasn't loud, not yet, but you could hear the weight of what she'd said settle across the hearing room like dust after a storm. No one reached for their water. No one looked away. The silence lasted just long enough to make Trump squirm. Then he leaned forward, eyes locked on Jasmine. That's cute, he said into the mic. You got all your headlines ready, all your little lines written out. I've seen this routine before, someone looking to go viral. He looked around the room as if searching for allies. None spoke. Trump turned back to her. You think a few tweets and angry college kids are more American than honoring the military? I've done more for vets than you could dream of. You're not interested in truth, you're interested in a soundbite. Jasmine didn't react. Not with a smile. Not with a retort. She simply reached into her folder and pulled out a printed spreadsheet. Mr. Trump, she said, voice. Even this is from the Congressional Budget Office. It breaks down how much of that parade money could have been used for mental health support across VA facilities. That's not a soundbite. That's data, Trump scoffed. And how much did your little protest contribute to the country? What did it build, huh? Jasmine raised her eyes, not at anger, but with something colder. Pity, respect. That's what it built. The words cut deeper than any insult. Trump leaned back, blinking slowly. You could see the gears turning his mind, chasing for a way out, something to reassert control. But the usual tricks, mockery-dominant spectacle were failing. The cameras didn't love him. The way they used to, the audience wasn't applauding. They were just watching, and that silence. That was Jasmine's power. A representative 2 chairs down tried to steer the hearing back to numbers, but the room was too charged. Now the spell had been broken, and everyone could feel the tension humming between the 2 figures in the middle of it all. Trump leaned in again. Let me ask you something. Congresswoman, did you serve? Jasmine nodded. I serve now, every day. He raised an eyebrow. That's not what I meant. She gave a slight shrug. Maybe not. But I think you already know that. Parading tanks doesn't prove service. Accountability does. Someone in the gallery tried not to clap. The chair cleared their throat and reminded everyone that applause wasn't permitted. Trump chuckled bitterly. You all love to talk about costs. What about the cost of disrespect, of letting the world think we're weak? Jasmine didn't flinch. You confuse volume with strength. Real strength doesn't need a flyover. It doesn't need to be televised. Trump looked away. A long moment passed. Then Jasmine leaned slightly toward her. Mike, this time speaking more slowly, you once said the quiet part out loud, Mr. Trump, that you could stand in the middle of Fifth Avenue and not lose a vote. Maybe that worked once, but the world's changed. People aren't following parades anymore. They're following truth. And there it was. The room didn't need cheers. It didn't need headlines. It needed that one person standing flat-footed in front of power and saying not anymore. The chair looked visibly uncomfortable, but said nothing. No one on the committee dared interrupt. No one on Trump's team reached out to pause the line of questioning, because even they could tell this wasn't a moment to interfere with. Trump opened his mouth to say something else, but it stalled. He glanced toward the cameras for reassurance, but the lenses weren't blinking. They were just capturing everything. And Jasmine, with no theatrics, no raised voice, no political grandstanding, folded her hands in front of her and waited. She had said what she came to say, but Trump wasn't finished. Not yet. And what came next would strip away whatever control he thought he still had. What followed didn't happen all at once. It wasn't explosive. It was slow. Like watching a balloon deflate from a pinhole air, hissing out faster than anyone could stop it. Trump shifted in his seat. The flush creeping up his neck was visible now, the kind that comes not from anger, but embarrassment. His hand hovered over the mic button again. He pressed it, let go, pressed it again. He had something to say, but the words weren't coming clean, not the way they used to when he finally spoke. His voice was uneven. You people act like I did something wrong, he said, gesturing with both hands. I gave this country a show of strength, a celebration. You think that's a crime? Now Jasmine sat still. Trump turned his head toward the chair. Why am I even here? To be scolded by someone reading from cue cards. He turned back to Jasmine. You think it, sacrifice? You think reading a report makes you a patriot? Jasmine didn't blink. The room didn't move. Let me tell you something. Trump continued, voice rising. You're just another puppet for the cameras. You've got your moment. Great, enjoy it. But the country knows what I've done. They remember. They always will. Someone on his team behind him leaned forward, an older man in a navy suit with a clipboard, trying to whisper something. Trump brushed him off. You don't get it, he said louder. Now they want strength. They want someone who isn't afraid to celebrate America. I brought the military out to remind people. We don't bow. We lead. He stood up fully. The chair tried to speak, but Trump kept going. Why don't you talk about what this country looked like when I was in charge? Gas prices, jobs, no wars. But no, that's not the story anymore. You want to talk about crowd sizes, empty seats? Try going to a Biden event. Try counting the people lining up to hear him mumble through a teleprompter. At this point, the chair leaned forward. Mr. Trump, please return to your seat and keep your responses within the scope of the hearing. He turned and pointed at them. Don't talk to me about scope. I'm the only reason any of you are even on TV right now. That drew a few gasps. One reporter in the gallery started texting frantically. The room was cracking open, and still, Jasmine remained motionless, not out of strategy, not out of smugness. She just knew the moment belonged to him. Now he had taken it and turned it against himself. Trump's hand slapped the table as he leaned in. This is a circus. You want accountability. Go look in the mirror. How many of you actually care about veterans, about this country? You sit here acting righteous. While your cities fall apart and your people lose faith, the chair tapped their gavel. Mr. Trump, we are suspending this portion of the hearing. But Trump wasn't finished. He pointed again. This time at no one in particular. You people don't want answers. You want blood? You want to humiliate me? But I'm not going anywhere. The gavel struck harder. Now order. Trump finally stepped back, chest rising and falling. Fast. Lips tight, the heat of the moment had overwhelmed the structure of the room. The hearing wasn't about defense spending anymore. It wasn't about facts. It was about pride, his pride, and the fact that for the first time in a long time, someone had challenged it and held their ground. Jasmine finally stood not to speak, but to signal that she was done. She collected her paper, slowly turned to the chair and said, I yield no smirk, no grand pose. Just a quiet final statement that told the room she'd already said what needed to be said. And Trump, he had just made her point louder than she ever could. The chair banged the gavel again, and they called for a recess. People began whispering, cameras panned across the room. Aides rushed to both sides, but the image that would end up on every evening news broadcast, in every headline and every tweet, was already burned into memory. Trump flushed and rattled, glaring at a woman who had calmly dismantled his narrative and never once raised her voice. But outside that hearing room, the internet was already catching fire, and the moment had taken on a life of its own. The moment Jasmine walked out of that hearing room, it was already everywhere. It didn't matter that she hadn't shouted, hadn't raised a fist, hadn't stormed out. In fact, that was what made it stick: her composure, her clarity. It stood in stark contrast to Trump's unraveling, and the internet noticed. By the time she stepped into the hallway, reporters were shouting questions, camera flashes strobing down the corridor. But Jasmine didn't stop. She gave a brief nod to her aide, kept her folder close to her side, and walked straight past the noise. No speeches, no victory. Lapped that silence. It was louder than anything Trump had said all day. Online, the videos were already stitched, cut, and captioned. One clip from C-SPAN showed Jasmine calmly delivering her line. Respect, that's what it built. Another clip showed Trump moments later losing his cool. Someone had edited them side by side. No commentary, no music. Just facts. It had over 4 million views in 3 hours. Another account posted a screenshot of Jasmine's still face. As Trump shouted over her, the caption read, "Grace under pressure." Versus pressure without grace. It went viral in minutes, every major news outlet LED with the hearing. By evening, CNN aired a split-screen analysis. MSNBC had a panel dissecting Jasmine's exact tone. Fox News tried to spin the story, blaming the committee, accusing Democrats of setting a trap. But even their hosts looked cornered by the footage by nightfall hashtags, trended globally. Crockett vs. Chaos, respect over rage. Empty chairs still speak, and beneath those tags came the stories. Veterans, healthcare workers, single moms, teachers, all weighing in. A Marine in San Diego tweeted that 40 million could have fixed the AC in my VA clinic. But sure, throw a parade, a nurse in Jackson wrote, I've never seen someone hold their ground like that. Crockett made me proud to be from this country today. Even celebrities got involved. A well-known actor reposted the hearing clip, adding every now and then someone actually shows up to do the job she did. But the real flood came from regular people, people who weren't political junkies, who didn't watch hearings for fun, who usually tuned out the drama. This time they tuned in, and they stayed, because something about watching a powerful man spiral under pressure, while a calm woman held her line, that hit a nerve. Trump's team scrambled again by 10 p.m. They had released a written statement calling the hearing a deeply partisan ambush, blaming unverified social media, hysteria, and insisting that the president had commanded the room with strength, but no one was buying it. Even some of Trump's former allies began to quietly shift their tone. A conservative podcast host, who once defended him, posted, "Look, I don't like the woman's politics, but she handled that better than I expected." He looked unprepared. Meanwhile, Jasmine hadn't posted a single word. Her Twitter feed remained blank. Her Instagram had nothing but a photo of a sunset from 3 days earlier. That silence wasn't an accident. She knew the story was stronger without her adding to it. Let them talk. Let them share. Let the truth do what it needed to do. Inside her apartment that night, she sat at her small kitchen table, sipping lukewarm tea. Her phone buzzed nonstop on the counter, vibrating with messages, missed calls, interview requests, and congratulations from colleagues. She didn't reach for it. She just sat back, eyes closed, breathing in the quiet. She hadn't gone into that hearing to humiliate anyone. She'd gone in to hold someone accountable. And, somehow without trying, she had become the voice millions were waiting for. Not because she shouted the loudest, but because she never needed to. Meanwhile, Trump was holed up in a suite at a hotel. Outside Baltimore, pacing furious, watching the coverage flip against him. In real time, at some point, one of his aides tried to suggest that maybe he should just let the story pass. It'll die down, they said, but Trump knew better. This wasn't just another news cycle. This was something worse. He had finally been outplayed in the one arena. He thought he owned the camera, but the real impact wasn't just going to live online. It was already moving through the streets, the homes, the polls, and it was only getting louder. By sunrise, the story had shifted from a political moment to something far bigger. It was on gas station radios in Shreveport, playing on break room TVs in Omaha. Teachers in Akron mentioned it in passing before morning. Roll call everywhere you looked. Someone had something to say about what happened in that hearing room. In a coffee shop in Flagstaff, two older veterans sat at a window table, phones in hand, watching Jasmine's response to Trump. On loop, one of them, a former Navy corpsman, tapped the screen with his finger and said, "That's how you handle a bully. Cool as ice." His buddy just nodded and sipped his coffee. Eyes fixed on the subtitles over in Gary, Indiana, a group of young organizers gathered around a folding table in a community center. Laptops open, they weren't just reposting clips. They were using the moment to fundraise for local causes. This isn't about dunking on Trump. One of them said it's about people finally seeing what real accountability looks like. Polling agencies scrambled to release new numbers. Overnight approval ratings showed a clear swing. Not a tidal wave, but a noticeable shift. Trump's favorability dipped among independents. More importantly, a surprising number of undecided voters said they felt disappointed by his performance and impressed by Crocker's local news outlets in places rarely mentioned in national coverage. Like Fargo El Paso Mobile began running segments titled, "Who is Jasmine Crockett?" Viewers wanted to know more. Who was she? Where did she come from? Why hadn't they heard this voice before? The truth is, she'd been there all along, speaking up, doing the work, but sometimes it takes the right moment, the right crack in the noise for someone to break through. And this was that moment. Meanwhile, the backlash inside Trump's camp was growing. A former speechwriter went on the record anonymously saying, "We told him not to go in unprepared. He thought he could steamroll. It turns out facts are harder to talk over when the cameras don't cut away." Even his most loyal online defenders struggled to mount a defense conspiracy. Theories popped up, claiming Jasmine was fed lines through an earpiece, or that the audience had been coached to react, but none of it stuck. There was nothing to disprove. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't gloat. She didn't need to, and that's what made it so hard to fight. In Oklahoma City, a pastor opened his Sunday sermon, not with scripture, but with a clip of the hearing. Sometimes he said to his congregation, "Truth shows up in plain clothes and speaks softly, but with fire behind every word," and back in D.C. Jasmine was already moving on. She wasn't doing a media tour. She wasn't chasing the wave. She was back at work attending another committee meeting 2 days later, asking questions about broadband access in rural communities when a reporter caught her on the way out and asked about the viral clip. She simply said, "I said what I needed to say." She knew better than to let the moment become the message. The message was bigger than her. At the same time, Trump was reportedly meeting with advisors to figure out a path forward. Multiple leaks from that meeting said he wanted to retaliate, go after her, as one aide put it, But cooler heads warned him doing so would only keep the spotlight on her, and the last thing they needed was another comparison between her calm and his chaos. By the end of the week, editorial columns began popping up in major papers and local blogs alike. One line from an op ed in the Pittsburgh Gazette summed it up best. We're used to politicians yelling past each other, but when one speaks calmly and the other panics, we learn who's performing and who's leading. That quote was screenshot and passed around thousands of times. Jasmine's team kept their heads down. They didn't start selling t-shirts or launching campaigns. They answered emails, returned calls, took meetings. They understood that respect once earned should be protected, not exploited, because this wasn't just about one person embarrassing another. It was about a country catching its breath, seeing something that reminded them leadership didn't have to mean arrogance, that humility wasn't weakness, that maybe, just maybe, politics could be less about domination and more about responsibility. But the real lesson, the one that would echo long after the headlines faded, was still to be written by the time the buzz wore off and the headlines thinned out. What remained wasn't just a viral moment, it was a mirror. The kind no one could easily turn away from. America had watched a man, once seen as untouchable, unravel in front of cameras. Not because he was shouted down or outmaneuvered, but because someone calmly refused to play his game. Jasmine Crockett hadn't insulted him. She hadn't interrupted. She didn't come with applause lines or flashy gestures. She just asked the kind of questions that come from someone who actually listens to the people who clean hospital floors, drive city buses, raise children on single incomes, and send their sons and daughters to war. The moral didn't come wrapped in a speech. It came in what Jasmine didn't do. She didn't gloat. She didn't tweet. I won. She didn't build her moment into a brand. That's what made it real. And for many Americans, especially those who had grown tired of noise and chaos, it felt like something new, even though it wasn't. It was a return, a reminder of what public service used to look like before everything became a performance. In the weeks that followed, something curious happened. A veteran from Cheyenne who had never voted before registered for the first time a high school civics teacher in Little Rock, changed her syllabus to include a unit on modern accountability, and used Jasmine's hearing footage as a case study. A city councilwoman in Toledo quoted her in a speech about how cities misuse funds for showy projects instead of putting money where it's needed. Jasmine didn't ask for those ripples. She didn't try to ride them. But they happened anyway, because the truth tends to echo in ways no campaign had ever could. As for Trump, he didn't recover as quickly. His base still clapped when he spoke, but something had shifted. More reporters pushed back during interviews. More voters asked questions instead of cheering. The shine was dimming, not because of a scandal or a headline, but because people had watched him be cornered by basic accountability. And he didn't have answers for all the money poured into that parade. The only thing anyone remembered was how empty it looked, and how one woman with no shouting and no theatrics made it clear that strength isn't about who talks the loudest, it's about who listens the longest. One night, weeks later, Jasmine was in a quiet diner in Cleveland. After a town hall, a young woman in scrubs approached her, visibly nervous, and said, "I just wanted to say thank you, not for the moment, for not making it about you." Then she walked out. Jasmine didn't even catch her name. That was the legacy. Not the clip, not the headlines, the impression left behind. In ordinary lives, the way people talked differently at dinner tables, the way kids paid closer attention in class, the way voters tired of performance politics started looking for steadier voices in the end. This wasn't just about Trump's parade or one viral hearing. It was about what happens when people are reminded that dignity still exists in public life, that someone can speak with clarity, confront power, and still walk away with grace, if there's a lesson in all of it. Maybe it's this: you don't have to match noise with noise. Sometimes the most powerful answer is restraint. Sometimes leadership is as simple as saying what needs to be said, and then sitting back and letting the silence speak for itself. If this story meant something to you, share it with someone who's forgotten what real leadership looks like. And if you're tired of watching politics like it's a show, maybe it's time to stop being the audience and start being the voice that holds the mic.